going deep in researching your body of work, which is vast and prolific and fascinating.
I know, it's a bit much.
Do you find it a bit much for you?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I had to give up on figuring out a public image, let alone a self-image, years ago, simply because my interests are really across the board. And I'm an old guy now, like I'm almost 70. So I've been doing this for, 50 years.
And have you always been like pathologically creative this way?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Redeemingly pathological.
What does redeemingly pathological mean?
It means I'm redeemed by art.
Right, right. It seems, I mean, your path seems unique in that it seems like you do what you want to do, and you've been able to do that for the bulk of your career without compromising or selling out.
Well, part of that is that I never wanted a career, and I never really went for the career thing. I just mostly went for how do I realize my dreams? And, I had to find out, well, what are my dreams? And my first dream was never to work a 9-to-5 job. So I had to figure out how to get by, without a kind of regular job. And the reason how that came about was I really felt like in order for me to do what I wanted to do, or even more essentially to do what I'm here to do, like a destiny thing, I needed to own my time. And so for me, time, as in the time of my life, not the 9-to-5 punch clock kind of time, but the time of my life, time in that essence way of time, has been my real currency. It's not, money is not the actual currency in my life. I know how to make money, but it's time that I live for.
Well, and that makes sense as well, being an astrologer, because doesn't that give you sort of a unique multi-dimensional understanding of time beyond our simple, like, third-dimensional fiction around it?
And even more essentially, it allows me to own my own time, meaning my service that I offer as an astrologer, it's on my time. I schedule it. And yeah, astrology in a sense acts as a language to track the timing of events. I'm not the kind of an astrologer, for example, that believes that the planets out there are influencing or controlling our fates down here. That's not, my angle. My angle is linguistic. I look at astrology as a language to help me articulate and communicate certain perceptions and experiences that English by itself I'm not able to do with, just by, speaking like normal.
And that being said, do you still incorporate the transits in looking at how they may or may not affect our experience here?
Well, I look at transits as the timing of change, but not their causes. And so I'm more interested in the timing of events and how, when a particular transit is occurring in a person's life, when it connects up with their own chart, then I look to see what's going on in their life. And so my meaning I look to what's going on in their life to understand the transit, not the other way around. So I look at life first. Life is more important. Life is larger than astrology to me.
That's interesting. And do you, from this particular approach, do you learn more about astrology this way? Are there times where you see life kind of trumping the astrological blueprint, or does it kind of reinforce the validity and legitimacy of what astrology, the language of astrology, is telling us?
Well, I like to think that, real life trumps any system that we impose on it, astrology being one of many systems. Like there's the Tarot, there's the Kabbalah, there's all these different systems and religions and philosophies that are imposed on the fluid dynamic of, real life, which tends to be more unpredictable and chaotic, I think.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So there's a specific angle that I'm really intrigued to get into with you. And just to back it up as far as how you and I will know one another, I know that we're friends from Facebook, and I wasn't sure like how I landed on your radar, if you have any recollection as to how it was we initially connected.
I think it was magic.
I'll take it.
I believe in magic.
I do too. I can't imagine what life on this planet would be like if one didn't.
Well, there's plenty of that to go around, and sad as it is, there's ways in which to combat the over literalist mindset that diminishes the imaginal faculties. And I'm a big proponent of imagination, of the faculty of imagination, really as a function of intelligence. And in fact, I would say my creative and artistic life since about 1991 or 92, so that's like, what's that, 30 years? So for the past 30 years, everything that I've done pretty much artistically, and also in terms of my life and my relations too, has been following a singular vision. And that vision is called the insurrection of the poetic imagination. So everything that I do is to stimulate the insurrection of the poetic imagination. Because I find that's an extremely important political cause. It's basically my politics. I don't vote. I'm not Republican or Democratic, or I'm not libertarian or communist or anything like that. My politics are one of poetics. And the reason why I think it's important is because, to me, my experience is that the way materialistic society has gone, there's been a great kind of epidemic, or maybe pandemic, of imagination death, resulting in a kind of a soulless society. And if you can't find a way to resurrect your imagination, I think you simply suffer from becoming a casualty of not just imagination loss, but soul loss. To me, imagination death precedes the death of soul. And it's kind of a heavy thing to say, but I really believe that to be true. And so it's been a kind of a political direction of my own life, is to continue resurrecting the imaginal faculties in new ways, mostly to sustain the life of my soul in a society that doesn't really regard or reward or respect, this wonderful, magical thing called soul.
That's so interesting. Specifically, the idea of resurrecting, because this viewpoint necessarily rests on the fact that the imagination is being squelched to begin with, and that it takes active conscious work to bring it back online.
I think for some of us it does. Of course, children, some children more than others, already have their imaginations intact. It's already embodied in the seriousness of their play with other kids and so forth. And, there's some adults that have managed to stay in touch with that inner child, where that inner child has not become so buried and withered within them that they still are children within themselves. And from that child place, they can still create, they can still improvise, find joy and wonder in existence, or joy and wonder in their own creations.
Yeah, I do think it is the type of thing these days that takes conscious work. And I also, in my mind, when we talk about, the imbalance between the masculine and the feminine, these kind of, ass backwards ideas of patriarchal control, the new age idea of the return of the divine feminine. To me, this is really the crux of it, is the overemphasis on left brain functions, rationalism, and then the de-emphasizing, moving over to like the marginalization and the mocking of intuition, emotion, poetics. So when I, see what's happening in terms of, the cultural discourse about putting women in positions in power, I don't really think that that's the answer. I think it's as exactly as you're talking about, resurrecting the imagination, resurrecting reverence for emotion, poetics, intuition, magic, the unseen.
Yeah, I think so too. And you see, it all kind of began a few hundred years ago with Descartes and his, meditations and the birth of the so-called age of reason, when, the intellect become deified. In a sense, the culture entered the church of reason. And at that time, what was once considered as sciences like alchemy, astrology back then was linked with astronomy as well. So during the Age of Reason, many of the so-called, what's now called the pseudosciences, were dismissed and even labeled in these kinds of persecutive labels like witchcraft, and people were burned for practicing astrology during the Age of Reason, and that kind of thing. So it's been ingrained in the collective psyche for a few hundred years, this deification of the intellect over other functions of intelligence. And in my work, there's a particular system I'm fond of. It's called the 8-circuit brain model that was made popular by Timothy Leary, and then his friend Robert Anton Wilson, and then also myself in my two books on the subject matter. So we look at intellect as a very important function of intelligence, but only one function of 8. And the whole kind of point of looking at 8 functions of intelligence is seeing how they all interact, they all relate with each other. It's not like a linear system where, you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 8, and then you're done. It's more of a kind of diagnostic grid. It's a way of, in a sense, being able to identify and track where you are showing intelligence, and also where you are showing ignorance. And those individuals who are interested in intelligence, or even in increasing their intelligence, will take to this system and be able to begin the humbling task of being exposed to the sources of their ignorance. And in doing so, if you can confess ignorance, you're already, gaining intelligence, right away. Anytime where you can say, I don't know, I'm clueless, I don't have a fucking clue. So at that point, your mind opens up. The mind closes when you become too damn sure of anything. And that's basically a recipe for a closed mind. It's just, too much certitude.
I like that. How has working with the 8-circuit brain changed you or expanded your capacities?
Well, actually, in a number of ways. I've been teaching this system online to groups of about 30 each time we meet. It's online, and it's just once a year, and it's not the same 30 people, but I cap it off at around 30 because I don't want to work with more than 30 people. But what it's helped me is also with learning how to interact with a greater variety of individuals who don't have English as their first language, and so to find ways of reaching people who are in different cultures, different backgrounds, different language systems, and that's been really informative for me, because in the United States, it's a very insular, kind of sheltered place to live. Unless you're traveling a lot, unless you really break out of the country and bump around the world, then you can see how insular the United States has really become. So this helps me kind of break that insular trance to interact with people from all around the world and discuss issues of intelligence and ignorance, and find out what it is that we're learning, and that sort of thing.
That sounds incredibly valuable. I'm intrigued for sure. In scoping, I told you before we started recording that I've been in a bit of a study mode around your extremely prolific body of work. I'm quite a fan of the word weird. One thing that I find intriguing is that you said you don't buy into the notion of a collective we.
Well, it's not like I don't buy into it. I just find that it's overused. What's lost in the constant use of the pronoun we is, especially if you're referring to personal experience, and instead you immediately go to the universal we, like we as a species should do this, and then everything will be better if only we would do this. And it overlooks the personal responsibility of what I, as a person, can do to become the change that I want to see in the world, so to speak. And so I'm a big proponent of individual integrity and testing one's own integrity by how honestly you can register the experience that you're having, and how honestly you can communicate and share what you're going through. And I think that if you can commit fully to your own subjective experience, to your things that you go through, it's going to reach at some point a more universal level. And you won't have to do it by sacrificing your individual integrity by just, using the we word all the time and forgetting about, where the experience actually comes from. It comes from the individual. It doesn't come from the collective. Experience itself starts in the individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of, it's a little bit, for me, it's a little bit fuzzy because, I'm obviously a fierce individualist, and I see a lot of the issues that the collective we are facing in the United States as this sort of exaggerated degree of individualism where everyone wants to be living their best lives and like having fun and not necessarily paying attention to how our actions are affecting the very epic stakes that we're playing with right now. So do you feel like these individual choices do affect the larger collective we, or is that not something that's part of your paradigm?
Well, I really liked what you were talking about the highly individualistic behavior of the United States culture and so forth, because it reminds me how young of a nation this is. It was established, in 1776, so as far as nations go, like as an entity, the United States is still in its adolescence. It's not grown up yet. I think it's starting to grow up. And a country typically grows up. The entity of a country typically matures through suffering of a real nature, not just self-created suffering, which is kind of like a phony suffering, but usually through war and usually through outside shocks, invasions, violations, where the entity of a nation has to stand up for itself, has to defend itself, has to find out what it's made of, and the integrity of that. And so, I totally understand, that a nation as young as the United States is pretty much going to be preoccupied with either fucking or fighting. I don't know what other way to put it, but it's more at an adolescent stage. And I don't think that can be rushed. I don't think that any amount of good intentions or certain new age guidelines or whatever is going to force maturity on the American psyche. I don't think that's going to happen. And like I said, I do think the national entity is undergoing a maturing at this time because there's simply more threat that the United States has to respond to. And as we as individuals too learn to respond more creatively, more productively to the threat of our survival, and not just to the threat of our physical survival, but the threat of emotional survival. We get threats to our intellectual survival. We get threats to our social survival. And this is part of, how I understand, the life process using the 8-circuit brain, because it goes through these 8 different definitions of survival, basically. The bottom 4, physical, emotional, intellectual, and social survival, in a sense represent the foundation of the developing ego personality. And then once it can be developed, then it can enter into the upper circuits as a way of discovering, how to more openly give of oneself. But you can't really give of oneself effectively if you don't have a self to start with. And so this is, I think, a big part of developing ego and individualism is to develop a strong enough sense of the self so you have a self to offer. And I think that ultimately that's the function of ego, is eventually to give it up.
Yes, I totally agree. As you were speaking, I was thinking of Claire Graves' spiral dynamics. And are you familiar with that system?
No, I don't know anything about that label or that system.
I mean, the basic gist is he's codifying the evolution of consciousness, and he color codes each stage so as not to create a hierarchy around it. And his theory is that consciousness develops through these stages in this exact order. No one skips any stages, but that, there's this leap from me consciousness to we consciousness, but that we can't get to we consciousness until we've, gone through the work of developing a really solid, authentic me consciousness. So it sounds to me a bit like you're speaking to that kind of self-responsibility that's necessary for everyone to take before we can then as a collective move into a we consciousness.
Well, that's been my personal experience. I've also, because I've been exposed to working with hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals in real time, in person throughout my life, because I've been deeply involved in teamwork processes of theater and filmmaking and ritual for the last 50 or more years. And what I've been able to discover in working with so many people, many of them highly creative individuals, is really how much damage and trauma people bring to the table, and are really searching for ways to cope with it, transform it, somehow get beyond it, so they don't have to keep repeating the same trauma over and over again. And oftentimes the trauma is a childhood trauma where there's this kind of repetitive thing. They just keep, it's the same button that gets pushed over and over again from the age of 7 on, whenever the trauma happened. And so I have a lot of compassion and understanding for imperfections, shortcomings, flaws, traumas, and damage. With people. I'm not into anything having to do with perfection at all.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what perfection means.
I think it's a corpse.
The perfect corpse.
Exactly.
It's interesting because in my, in the coaching and consulting work that I do, and I work very specifically with language, is I'm attuned to how the you and me creates separation, right? And it's specifically the prescriptive you, when I'm working with clients, how that can sometimes trigger defenses, trigger an amygdala response. So in my work, I've found it more helpful to move into the inclusive we, especially when supporting people in integrating their traumas and their hurts and their suffering, such that it kind of, expanding the process so that we can understand that, like, we all have suffering, we all have flaws, we all have shadows. Yes, it is our individual responsibility to heal them. And I think a lot of people can sometimes feel like there's something wrong with me, or I'm bad, or I'm broken. And so I tend to utilize the we just to make the process of transmuting our shadows a little bit more human and less like I've been singled out as this terrible person who these horrible things happen to.
Yeah, it sounds like you have found an effective approach there. I almost look at it from the other way around. I have such a, innate sense of the unity of all people. I know the we thing by heart, so I don't really need to emphasize it. I already know that we're all human beings. And so my approach is more to hone in on the distinctions of each individual, so that I approach each individual clearly on a case-by-case basis, meaning really tuning into their strengths, their weaknesses, their particular talents, the places where they're putting up walls and defenses. And this has taken a long, long time to get to a place where I'm perceiving more than I'm projecting. Because there's a huge difference, of course, between perception and projection. And so, any kind of work with others has always been preceded by self-work for me. There's no way that I can work with anyone on anything that I haven't first worked on in myself.
Yeah, I respect that big time. Thank you for holding that for everyone you work with and for yourself.
Oh yeah, no, and the thing is if I encounter someone that's undergoing something that I haven't gone through and I don't know anything about, I just tell them I don't know what to say or what to do here. You're on your own, or I would recommend them to somebody else.
Interesting. So you have a very experiential methodology.
Oh yeah, very much. In fact, I just finished writing a book. It just was published a few months ago. It's called Experiential Astrology. And so my angle, even in the astrological language, is to find a way to relate to the language in a more embodied way. So how to approach the experience of the symbols of the planets on the chart. I refer to them not as planets, but as forces.
Mm-hmm.
And, like the moon, the force of emotion or the force of habit. Everybody knows what the force of habit is, or the force of will. Everyone knows that it's a very common force. But once someone can begin to find their own personal experience of the forces at play, something opens up for them. It's called experience. Okay, now they know what Mars is, the force of will. Oh, that's when I'm getting really pushy. This is Mars, pushy. I know that force. That's my experience. So so I go through all the planetary symbols and break it down to very specific forces that people experience in their bodies, but also outside of their bodies, because there's cultural forces, there's impersonal cultural forces that are often represented by Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so it becomes really fascinating to me that this distinction between personal forces, which are forces I think that one can experience and even control to some degree. And then there are impersonal forces that really are not controllable. They're not really, sometimes you can't even comprehend them because they're so large and vast, because they connect up with these collective movements and trends, and you find yourself snagged in on it, and all of a sudden you're in this big hurricane or tsunami of herd mentality that's moving through the land, and you're looking for a way to ground yourself and differentiate and get back to who you are, so you don't get lost in the sauce of the herd.
Mm-hmm. I can relate. I have a lot of transpersonal energies in my chart that sometimes have very large effects, and it's very helpful for me to remind myself, like, oh, this isn't me. This is not personal.
Exactly. And I think that's a really significant distinction, to know what's not actually personal, especially for some individuals who maybe have a highly emphasized moon in their chart, or a lot of the archetype of Cancer, that these individuals can tend to take things way too personally.
I definitely experienced that of people with Cancer in their chart.